the earliest days of the shinobi world, long before villages carried names and banners, the land itself seemed to breathe in conflict. Small clans lived close to the earth, moving with the seasons, fighting not for ideology, but for survival. Children learned to run before they learned to read the sky. And grief arrived early, settling into families like a second hearth fire, always present, always warm, always dangerous if left unattended. It was into this world that Madara Uchiha was born, not as a symbol or a legend, but as a child surrounded by brothers, by laughter that felt rare and precious, and by a quiet understanding that none of it was guaranteed to last. The Uchiha clan lived by intensity. Their emotions ran deep, not as a flaw, but as a response to the world they inhabited. Love, loyalty, pride, sorrow. These were not abstract ideas, but forces that shaped how they fought and how they lived. Madara grew up watching his brothers train, watching their strength sharpen alongside their bonds, each sparring match reinforcing the idea that survival depended on trust within the clan and suspicion beyond it. Peace, in this era, was not an expectation. It was a brief silence between battles, something noticed only when it ended. Madara's early years were defined by connection. He loved fiercely, especially his younger brother Izuna, whose presence anchored him to something softer than war. Together, they imagined futures that did not involve endless bloodshed, even if those imaginings were vague and unformed. At this stage, Madara did believe in peace, not as a philosophy, but as a hope born from attachment. Peace meant his brothers would live. Peace meant tomorrow would look like today. It was not yet a grand concept, only a desire. But the world around him did not bend to desire. Battles with rival clans, especially the Senju, were relentless and cyclical. Victories were temporary, losses permanent. One by one, Madara's brothers fell, each death carving something out of him that could never be replaced. These were not heroic sacrifices remembered fondly. They were abrupt endings, lives cut short before they could become anything else. Each loss taught Madara the same lesson from a different angle. Good intentions did not stop spears, and hope did not shield the heart from grief. As a child, and then as a young warrior, Madara began to notice a pattern that extended beyond his own pain. Every clan believed it fought for survival. Every side mourned its dead. Every leader promised protection, yet could only offer more war. The shinobi system was not broken, he realized. It was functioning exactly as designed. Violence fed violence. Revenge justified itself endlessly. Peace, if it existed at all, was always conditional, always temporary. This realization did not come to Madara as bitterness at first. It came as clarity. He was not yet rejecting peace. He was questioning its foundation. How could peace last if it depended on mutual restraint between people shaped by loss? How could treaties survive the next generation of children raised on old grudges? These questions did not make him cruel. They made him observant. And observation, over time, hardened into conviction. When Madara first encountered Hashirama Senju, not as an enemy, but as a mirror, something unexpected happened. Hashirama shared his exhaustion with war, his longing for a future where children would not need to fight. Their conversations, brief and cautious, hinted at a different possibility. For the first time, Madara saw peace not just as a personal wish, but as a structural goal, something that might be built rather than hoped for. Hashirama believed that understanding and cooperation could break the cycle. Madara wanted to believe him. This moment is important, because Madara did not give up on peace easily. He stood at its edge and considered it seriously. When the idea of forming a village emerged, uniting clans under shared rules and leadership, Madara supported it. He fought alongside Hashirama to end the era of endless clan warfare. He helped lay the foundation for Konohagakure, not because he was naive, but because he believed that shared power might restrain humanity's worst impulses. Yet even in these early days of the village, doubt lingered. Madara watched how quickly trust turned into political calculation. He noticed how leadership roles consolidated around certain bloodlines, how fear of the Uchiha quietly spread despite their contributions. The village preached unity, but old instincts remained. People still categorized one another, still prepared for betrayal, still armed themselves just in case. Peace, Madara began to understand, had not replaced conflict. It had simply reorganized it. The death of Izuna marked a turning point that cannot be overstated. Izuna did not die in some abstract war for peace. He died fighting the same enemies, under the same conditions, with the same justifications as before. The village existed now, but it had not saved the person Madara loved most. Standing over Izuna's fading life, Madara was confronted with a truth that would echo through every decision he made afterward. Peace that allows suffering to continue is not peace at all. It is delay. This was the moment when Madara's philosophy began to shift from hopeful construction to radical prevention. If the world could not sustain peace through agreements, then perhaps peace needed to be enforced at a deeper level. If human choice inevitably led back to conflict, then perhaps choice itself was the problem. These were not the thoughts of a villain reveling in destruction. They were the thoughts of someone who had watched every reasonable solution fail. Hashirama continued to believe in gradual progress, in moral example, in patience. Madara no longer could. To him, patience meant more graves. Progress meant generations sacrificed along the way. The very system that promised peace asked people like Izuna to die, so that someday, perhaps, things would be better. Madara rejected that bargain. From this point onward, Madara's understanding of peace became absolute rather than conditional. He no longer asked how to reduce conflict. He asked how to end it permanently. And once that question was asked, the path narrowed quickly. The world, as it existed, was incompatible with lasting peace. Something fundamental had to change. Madara did not hate humanity. In many ways, he understood it too well. He saw how emotions drove people to harm one another, how love could turn into vengeance, how ideals bent under fear. He saw these traits in himself as clearly as in others. That was precisely why he lost faith in a peace built on trust. Trust required people to overcome their nature consistently, across generations. History suggested they would not. By the time Madara turned away from the village and from Hashirama, he was no longer chasing domination or recognition. He was chasing certainty. A world without war could not rely on hope. It needed structure that eliminated the conditions for conflict altogether. This conviction would eventually lead him toward the idea of a dreamlike peace, one imposed not through armies, but through illusion. A reality where suffering could no longer arise because desire itself was contained. But at this stage, Madara had not yet become the architect of the Infinite Tsukuyomi. He was still a man standing in the aftermath of loss, looking at a world that promised peace while continuing to feed on blood. His abandonment of peace was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate withdrawal, shaped by evidence rather than impulse. In giving up on peace, as others defined it, Madara believed he was honoring the dead more honestly than those who continued to compromise. To him, accepting a flawed peace meant accepting endless sacrifice. And that was something he could no longer do. After the village was formed, the world did not suddenly grow quiet. The clang of steel softened into distant echoes, but it never fully disappeared. For Madara, this period felt less like peace and more like a careful performance, one sustained by rules, titles, and the shared fear of returning to chaos. Konohagakure stood as a symbol of a new era, yet beneath its fresh wooden walls and hopeful banners, the same instincts stirred. People remembered old wounds. They whispered old names. They measured one another, not by intention, but by lineage. Madara watched this carefully. Where Hashirama saw progress, Madara saw fragility. He noticed how power settled into structures that favored some voices over others, how decisions, meant to represent unity, were quietly shaped by majority comfort rather than shared sacrifice. The Uchiha, once feared and respected as warriors, were now observed with suspicion. Their strength, once essential, became unsettling in times that claimed to value harmony. Madara felt this shift long before it was openly acknowledged. It was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The village had been built to stop war between clans, but it did not dismantle the emotional machinery that created war in the first place. People still loved fiercely, still feared loss, still passed their pain onto the next generation through stories and silences. Children now trained together instead of against one another, but they were still taught that violence was the ultimate answer when ideals failed. The tools of conflict had been reorganized, not erased. Madara began to question whether peace achieved through balance of power was peace at all. If harmony depended on everyone being afraid of what would happen if it broke, then peace was nothing more than a stalemate. And stalemates, he knew, eventually collapse. Someone always grows impatient. Someone always believes they can gain more. Hashirama, for all his optimism, believed that time itself would heal these wounds. He believed that if children grew up without witnessing constant war, they would choose differently than their parents. Madara wanted to believe this, but every historical example told him otherwise. Trauma did not vanish simply because circumstances improved. It adapted. It waited. It resurfaced in new forms. The death of Izuna had already proven this to him. The village existed, yet it had not arrived in time. It had not prevented the loss that mattered most. For Madara, this was not an unfortunate exception. It was evidence that peace built gradually would always arrive too late for someone. There would always be another Izuna, another child lost while leaders debated patience. As Madara withdrew emotionally from the village, he did not do so loudly. There was no immediate betrayal, no dramatic declaration. Instead, there was distance. He stopped seeing himself reflected in the future Hashirama envisioned. Where Hashirama spoke of generations, Madara thought of individuals. Where Hashirama accepted imperfection as a step forward, Madara saw imperfection as the seed of future catastrophe. The concept of leadership weighed heavily on him during this time. Madara believed that true leadership required the courage to prevent suffering before it occurred, not merely respond to it afterward. To him, allowing a flawed system to continue simply because it was better than the last one was an abdication of responsibility. If a leader could see the inevitable outcome of a system, then allowing it to persist was a form of quiet cruelty. This belief placed Madara increasingly at odds with the village's direction. The more Konoha stabilized, the more it relied on compromise. And compromise, in Madara's eyes, was how ideals eroded. Every concession made to maintain peace chipped away at the promise that peace was meant to fulfill. Slowly, peace became less about protecting life and more about preserving structure. Madara's thoughts began to stretch beyond the village, beyond clans, beyond the visible world itself. If conflict was rooted in human emotion, desire, fear, attachment, then perhaps no political system could ever truly end it. Systems were built by humans, and humans carried their flaws into everything they created. This realization did not lead Madara to despair. Instead, it led him to radical clarity. What if peace could exist without requiring humans to overcome themselves? This question marked a profound shift. Until now, peace had always been framed as a moral achievement, something people had to choose repeatedly. Madara began to consider peace as a condition rather than a choice, something stable, permanent, and immune to emotional fluctuation. In this framing, free will was no longer sacred. It was dangerous. Madara understood how unsettling this idea was. He did not embrace it lightly. But the alternative, a world that endlessly demanded sacrifice in the name of future harmony, felt worse. Choice had given him brothers and taken them away. Choice had allowed wars to restart under new banners. If choice was the problem, then removing its capacity to harm became, paradoxically, an act of mercy. This was the philosophical soil in which Madara's later plans would grow. Not from madness, not from cruelty, but from exhaustion and grief sharpened into logic. He was not seeking control for its own sake. He was seeking finality, an end to cycles, an end to mourning. When Madara eventually clashed with Hashirama, it was not simply a battle of strength, but of world views. Hashirama fought for a future built slowly by imperfect people. Madara fought for a future where imperfection no longer had the power to destroy lives. Their conflict was inevitable because they were answering different questions. Hashirama asked how people could become better. Madara asked whether people needed to remain the way they were at all. As Madara walked away from the village, he did so knowing he would be remembered as a traitor. He accepted this. Reputation mattered less to him than results. If peace required him to be hated, then hatred was a small price to pay. After all, he had already learned that emotions ruled the world. He was simply choosing not to be ruled by them anymore. Yet even in his departure, Madara carried sorrow rather than malice. He did not celebrate the collapse he believed would come. He mourned that it was necessary. His vision of peace was cold, yes, but it was also quiet. No more cries of children on battlefields. No more brothers dying in each other's arms. No more waiting for the world to become kind. Madara's abandonment of conventional peace was not a rejection of harmony itself. It was a rejection of fragile harmony, the kind that demanded endless vigilance and endless loss. What he sought instead was a peace that could not be broken, because it no longer depended on human restraint. This idea, once fully formed, would guide every step he took from that moment onward. And so, as the village continued forward without him, believing it had outgrown the era of clan warfare, Madara moved into legend. Not as a monster, but as a man who saw the cracks in paradise before anyone else was willing to admit they were there. As Madara withdrew from the village and from the future Hashirama continued to build, his thoughts turned inward, becoming slower, heavier, and more expansive. Removed from the daily rhythm of leadership and negotiation, he was left alone with memory, with pattern, and with history itself. Isolation did not make his ideas erratic. It refined them. Without the need to persuade or compromise, Madara allowed his philosophy to develop without restraint, following each conclusion to its natural end, no matter how uncomfortable that end might be. He reflected often on the nature of the shinobi world before villages existed. In that era, violence was honest in its cruelty. Clans fought openly, knowing exactly what they were risking. The village system, by contrast, wrapped violence in ideals. It spoke of peace while training soldiers. It spoke of unity while assigning ranks and borders. To Madara, this made suffering more insidious, not less. Death had not vanished. It had merely been delayed, disguised, and redistributed. The more Madara thought about it, the more he realized that peace, as commonly defined, was deeply conditional. It required constant maintenance. It demanded vigilance, compromise, and emotional discipline from people who had been shaped by trauma. Even one failure, one leader acting out of fear, one village seeking advantage, could unravel decades of stability. History was full of such collapses. Madara saw no reason this time would be different. This led him to a grim conclusion. Peace that depends on vigilance is not peace, but exhaustion. Madara's own life served as proof. He had been vigilant. He had been cautious. He had allied with his former enemy. And still, he lost what mattered most. If someone like him, who understood the cost of war intimately, could not protect his brother under this new system, then who could? The promise of peace felt increasingly hollow, a story people told themselves to endure the present rather than a solution capable of transforming it. It was during this period that Madara's attention turned toward the deeper myths of the world, stories passed down not as strategy, but as origin, tales of Chakra's arrival, of ancient powers, of a time before shinobi politics. These were not merely legends to Madara. They were evidence that the world had once been fundamentally different, and that it could be altered again. The Sage of Six Paths became central to Madara's contemplation. Hagoromo's story suggested that conflict was not an eternal law of nature, but a consequence of how power and understanding were distributed. Chakra, intended as a means of connection, had been weaponized through fear and desire. Madara saw in this not a moral failure, but a predictable outcome. Give flawed beings power, and that power would amplify their flaws. This realization pushed Madara further away from the idea that education, time, or moral teaching could save the world. If chakra itself could be twisted by emotion, then no amount of goodwill would prevent its misuse. Peace required more than restraint. It required a reconfiguration of reality itself. Madara began to think in terms of absolutes. Temporary peace was unacceptable. Generational sacrifice was unacceptable. Any solution that allowed suffering to continue, even in smaller amounts, was fundamentally insufficient. This was not impatience. It was consistency. If the goal was peace, then peace had to be total. Anything less was a compromise masquerading as virtue. It was here that Madara's philosophy crossed a threshold. Until now, he had questioned systems. Now, he questioned perception. What if the world people experienced, the world of scarcity, competition, and loss, was itself the problem? What if suffering was not just a social issue, but a consequence of how reality was processed and understood by the human mind? Dreams offered a clue. In dreams, pain could be escaped, loss could be undone, desires could be fulfilled without harming others. In dreams, conflict dissolved because the conditions that produced it no longer applied. Madara did not see dreams as childish fantasy. He saw them as proof that the mind could exist in a state free from suffering, if freed from the constraints of the physical world. The idea was subtle at first, more curiosity than plan. But the longer Madara sat with it, the more compelling it became. If the mind could be placed into a stable, shared dream, one carefully constructed to eliminate fear, jealousy, and grief, then peace would no longer need enforcement. It would simply exist. Critics would later call this escapism. Madara saw it as compassion. He had watched people break under the weight of reality. He had watched love turn into hatred, ideals into justification for murder. Expecting humanity to transcend these patterns on its own now seemed not just unrealistic, but cruel. Why demand endless strength from beings already exhausted by loss? Why insist on free will if that freedom led almost inevitably to suffering? To Madara, the answer was simple: because people were afraid to let go of control, even when control was killing them. This philosophy did not erase Madara's sadness. If anything, it deepened it. He was acutely aware that his vision would erase something people cherished: the ability to choose, to struggle, to fail. But he questioned whether those things were inherently valuable, or whether they were simply familiar. Tradition had sanctified suffering, framing it as necessary for growth. Madara rejected this entirely. Growth that required graves was not growth worth preserving. As his ideas solidified, Madara also began to understand why Hashirama could never accept them. Hashirama believed in people as they were, with all their flaws. Madara believed that those flaws were precisely why the world could not be trusted to itself. Where Hashirama saw dignity in struggle, Madara saw unnecessary pain. Their disagreement was not about power or leadership. It was about mercy. To Hashirama, mercy meant allowing people to live freely, even if that freedom caused harm. To Madara, mercy meant removing the conditions that allowed harm to arise in the first place. These definitions could never align. One trusted humanity. The other mourned it too deeply to risk trusting it again. Madara's increasing detachment from the world did not make him indifferent to it. On the contrary, it was because he cared so intensely that he could not accept partial solutions. Every war that followed, every child trained to fight, every village forced into conflict confirmed what he already believed. The cycle did not slow. It merely changed rhythm. By the time Madara fully committed himself to his vision, peace, as the world understood, it had become irrelevant to him. Negotiation, treaties, alliances. These were tools for managing conflict, not eliminating it. He no longer sought to guide the world gently. He intended to overwrite its foundations. This was the point of no return, not because Madara became evil, but because he became absolute. Once suffering was deemed unacceptable under any circumstances, extreme measures became not just reasonable, but necessary. The dream of peace had transformed from a shared hope into a solitary burden only he was willing to carry. Madara accepted that history would not understand him. He accepted that his name would be cursed. These were trivial costs compared to the endless mourning he sought to end. If the world needed a villain to finally rest, he was willing to be that villain. And so, as time moved forward, and the village continued its fragile experiment, Madara stood apart, holding a vision of peace that did not ask humanity to become better, but to finally be free from itself, with his philosophy now crystallizing into something vast and uncompromising. Madara turned his attention to the mechanisms of the world itself, the forces that shaped destiny beyond individual intention. If peace could not be achieved through trust, and if human choice reliably reproduced conflict, then the solution would have to operate at a level deeper than politics, deeper even than morality. It would have to engage with the architecture of reality, with chakra, with perception, and with the quiet ways power shaped history long before people realized they were being guided by it. Madara's understanding of chakra evolved far beyond its use as a weapon. To most shinobi, chakra was a tool, something to be refined, controlled, and deployed. To Madara, it became a language through which reality expressed itself. Chakra carried intention, memory, and emotion. It was not neutral. Every technique revealed something about the user's inner state. Every clash a collision, not just of force, but of will. This, Madara realized, was why conflict was so persistent. Chakra amplified emotion, and emotion, left unchecked, inevitably spiraled into violence. The more Madara studied the world's history, the more clearly he saw how power concentrated around symbols and myths. Clans rose and fell not only through strength, but through stories people believed about them. The Senju were remembered as builders. The Uchiha were remembered as cursed. These narratives shaped expectation, and expectation shaped action. People treated the Uchiha with suspicion because they believed suspicion was warranted. That suspicion then created the very conditions it feared. Madara saw this as another example of how perception created reality, rather than merely reflecting it. This realization reinforced his belief that peace could not be sustained in a shared physical world where perception differed endlessly from person to person. As long as people saw one another through lenses of fear and desire, conflict would regenerate. Any peace built atop such unstable foundations would always be temporary. The world itself was too subjective, too fractured by individual experience. Madara began to understand something crucial. The problem was not just suffering, but inequality of experience. Some lived in comfort, while others endured constant loss. Some were protected by walls and titles, while others were sent to die quietly for causes they barely understood. This imbalance bred resentment, which bred violence, which justified further imbalance. Peace treaties did nothing to address this fundamental asymmetry. They simply froze it in place. In Madara's mind, a true peace would require uniformity of experience, not equality in resources or opportunity, but in fulfillment. If everyone experienced contentment, then jealousy would lose its power. If everyone's emotional needs were met, then ambition would soften. Conflict would no longer serve a purpose. This was not tyranny to Madara. It was harmony through design. It was around this time that Madara's attention became fixed on the Sharingan and its deeper potential. The eye was not merely a weapon of prediction and illusion. It was a conduit into perception itself. Through it, Madara glimpsed how easily the mind could be guided, how reality could be reshaped without resistance if the illusion was complete enough. Genjutsu was not deception. It was authorship. The ability to write experience directly into the consciousness of another being. To Madara, this was not horrifying. It was revelatory. If perception defined reality, then altering perception altered reality. Pain could be removed without erasing the body. Loss could be soothed without undoing the past. Meaning itself could be curated. Madara understood that people already lived inside narratives imposed by society, by trauma, by history. The difference was that those narratives were chaotic and cruel. What he envisioned was intentional and kind. Yet even as his ideas expanded, Madara remained aware of the cost. A world without struggle would be a world without growth, as it was traditionally understood. There would be no heroes forged by hardship, no stories of perseverance against impossible odds. Many would argue that such a world was hollow. Madara disagreed. To him, those stories were monuments to failure. They celebrated survival in systems that should never have required survival in the first place. Madara's thoughts often returned to children, the ones he had been, the ones he had lost, the ones now growing up in the villages. They were still being trained to fight, still being taught that violence was sometimes necessary, still inheriting fears they did not choose. The village had reduced the scale of war, but it had not removed war from the human imagination. As long as shinobi existed, so too would conflict. This understanding stripped Madara of any remaining attachment to gradual reform. He no longer believed the world could be nudged toward peace. It had to be transformed entirely. And transformation, by definition, required force, not necessarily physical violence, but decisive intervention. Madara's eventual confrontation with Hashirama was therefore inevitable. Not because Madara desired domination, but because their coexistence had become philosophically impossible. Hashirama represented faith in humanity's ability to grow beyond itself. Madara represented the refusal to gamble lives on that faith. Their clash was the collision of optimism and certainty, of hope and resolve. Even as they fought, Madara did not hate Hashirama. In fact, he respected him deeply. Hashirama's compassion was genuine, his strength immense. But Madara saw Hashirama as part of the tragedy, someone whose kindness would unintentionally allow future suffering. To Madara, Hashirama's mercy toward the present condemned the future to repeat the past. When Madara fell, when history believed him defeated, his philosophy did not die with him. It simply went underground, waiting. Ideas of that magnitude do not disappear. They linger in the spaces between generations, in the unanswered questions people avoid asking because the answers are too unsettling. Madara understood this. He was patient. Time, after all, only strengthened his argument. Every war that followed his supposed end was proof. From beyond the stage of history, Madara watched the world continue its patterns. Villages rose, alliances formed, conflicts reignited. Children inherited the burdens of their parents. Peace remained conditional, fragile, and incomplete. Nothing fundamental had changed. This did not surprise him. It confirmed everything he believed. Madara's legacy at this point was not action, but inevitability. The world was moving toward his conclusion, whether it realized it or not. As long as suffering persisted, someone would eventually seek a final solution. Madara simply happened to be the first to articulate it fully. In his vision, the end of conflict was not dramatic. It was quiet. No armies clashing, no cities burning. Just a world slowly exhaling, tension dissolving as desire lost its edge. People would live full lives without loss defining them. Dreams would replace struggle, not as escape, but as fulfillment. Reality would become gentle. Whether that vision was beautiful or terrifying depended entirely on whether one valued freedom over peace. Madara had made his choice long ago. Freedom had taken too much from him. Peace, even if imposed, felt like the only remaining kindness the world could offer itself. And so, Madara's philosophy moved closer to completion, not as madness, not as ambition, but as a final, unwavering answer to a question that had haunted him since childhood. How many lives must be lost before peace is no longer worth waiting for? As Madara's ideas moved from philosophy into intention, he began to consider not only what peace should look like, but how it could realistically be achieved within the constraints of the world as it existed. Vision alone was not enough. History was filled with dreamers whose ideals collapsed under the weight of practical reality. Madara refused to be one of them. If peace was to be absolute, then its foundation had to be unassailable, rooted in forces older and more powerful than villages, clans, or even individual will. This was when Madara's attention returned, again and again, to the origins of chakra itself. Chakra was not merely energy. It was inheritance. It carried the intentions of the past forward into the present, shaping the future in subtle but relentless ways. Every shinobi was a vessel not only of their own desires, but of ancestral memory. This explained why conflict felt inevitable. People were not starting from neutrality. They were born already leaning toward struggle, already shaped by stories of loss they had never personally experienced. Madara saw this most clearly in the Uchiha. The so-called curse of hatred was not, in his view, a flaw unique to his clan. It was simply more visible there because the Uchiha felt deeply and honestly. Others carried the same impulses, but buried them beneath ideology or duty. The Uchiha suffered more not because they were weaker, but because they refused to dull their emotions. Madara did not resent this. He saw it as proof that suppressing pain did not eliminate it. It only delayed its expression. This understanding reinforced his belief that emotional freedom within the existing world order was impossible. To feel fully was to suffer. To suppress feeling was to fracture internally. Either path led back to harm. The only solution, then, was to create a state where emotions could exist without producing conflict, where desire no longer demanded possession, and love no longer transformed into fear of loss. Madara's thoughts began to orbit the moon, not as a symbol, but as a mechanism. The moon existed above borders, above politics, above time itself. It watched silently as generations rose and fell, unchanged by their struggles. To Madara, this constancy represented something the world below lacked: stability without effort. If peace could be anchored to something eternal, then it would not erode under pressure. Ancient records and fragmented lore hinted at possibilities far beyond conventional ninjutsu. Madara pieced these fragments together, slowly, patiently, building a picture of a world once unified under a single vision. The power associated with the 10 tails was not merely destructive. It was foundational. It represented chakra in its raw, undivided form, before it had been fractured into individual ambition. This idea fascinated Madara. Division, he realized, was at the heart of all suffering. Chakra divided into individuals. Land divided into nations. People divided into clans, ideologies, identities. Every division created an edge, and every edge became a point of conflict. What humanity called diversity, Madara increasingly saw as fragmentation without coordination. This was not a rejection of individuality in the emotional sense. Madara did not believe people were meaningless. He believed they were incomplete when isolated. His vision was not to erase identity, but to harmonize it, to place all minds within a single, shared context where misunderstanding could no longer occur. No more misaligned intentions. No more fear born from ignorance of another's inner world. The Infinite Tsukuyomi, though not yet fully named, began to take shape in Madara's mind, not as a weapon, but as a sanctuary, a place where every individual could experience fulfillment tailored perfectly to them, without cost to anyone else. In such a world, competition lost relevance. Comparison dissolved. Suffering, stripped of its narrative fuel, simply faded away. Madara understood how radical this sounded. He knew others would call it domination, imprisonment, or death of the self. But these criticisms relied on an assumption Madara no longer accepted, that consciousness, bound to physical reality, was the highest form of existence. He had seen too much pain born from that assumption. To him, clinging to the physical world despite its cruelty was not courage. It was inertia. The shinobi world prided itself on endurance. Madara questioned whether endurance was truly virtuous or merely habitual. If a person could live without loss, without fear, without grief, would they truly be lesser for it? Or would they finally be free to exist without armor? Madara's resolve hardened as he observed the world continue without him. New leaders rose. New wars sparked. Even when peace held, it did so through threat and deterrence. The language of violence remained embedded in every institution. Shinobi were still weapons, even if they were called protectors. Children were still trained for battle, even if they were told it was for peace. Each of these observations removed another doubt. Madara no longer saw himself as acting against the world, but on behalf of it. Someone had to be willing to carry the burden of making the final choice. Someone had to be willing to sacrifice reputation, autonomy, even moral approval, in exchange for ending the cycle entirely. Madara accepted this role not because he desired it, but because no one else would. In this sense, Madara's philosophy became deeply selfless. He did not imagine himself ruling the dream world as a king. He did not envision worship or gratitude. In fact, he expected none of it. The highest success of his plan would be anonymity, peace so complete that no one would remember the suffering that preceded it, or the person who ended it. This willingness to erase himself from history was what truly separated Madara from conquerors and tyrants. They sought recognition. Madara sought silence. Yet even as his certainty grew, there was an undercurrent of sorrow that never left him. Madara did not rejoice in the idea that the world needed to be rewritten. He grieved that it had come to this at all. His plan was not born from hatred of life, but from an overwhelming love for it, one that could no longer tolerate watching it tear itself apart. Peace, as Madara now defined it, was not something people earned. It was something they were owed. No child consented to the world they were born into. No one agreed to inherit centuries of violence. If peace could be given freely, without cost, then withholding it became the greater injustice. By the end of this period, Madara's path was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. Every belief, every observation, every loss pointed toward the same conclusion. The world would never stop hurting itself voluntarily. Someone had to end the argument. And Madara had already decided that someone would be him. By the time Madara's vision reached this stage of clarity, his understanding of conflict had expanded beyond nations and generations into something almost geological in scale. War, to him, was no longer an event. It was a condition, one that resurfaced wherever human desire intersected with scarcity and fear. Even moments of peace, when examined closely, were shaped by anticipation of future violence. People stockpiled weapons, trained soldiers, and passed down warnings disguised as wisdom. Peace existed, but only as a pause held together by anxiety. Madara began to see this as a form of collective tension, a quiet pressure that never fully released. Entire societies lived as though bracing for impact, even when nothing immediate threatened them. Children learned to admire strength long before they understood compassion. Heroes were praised not for preventing conflict, but for surviving it. The world rewarded resilience, not gentleness. To Madara, this was evidence that peace had never truly replaced war. It had simply learned to coexist with it. This realization pushed Madara further away from any belief that reform could succeed. Systems could be redesigned, leaders replaced, borders redrawn, but the underlying rhythm remained unchanged. Conflict was always justified as necessary, always framed as unfortunate but unavoidable. Over time, people stopped questioning this assumption. War became naturalized, woven into culture so deeply that imagining a world without it felt unrealistic, even childish. Madara rejected this normalization entirely. He understood that most people did not actively want war. They wanted safety, meaning, and belonging. But the methods they used to secure those things consistently produced violence. Nations sought security through dominance. Individuals sought meaning through comparison. Belonging was defined by exclusion as often as inclusion. These patterns were not malicious, but they were deeply ingrained. Left unchallenged, they would repeat forever. It was here that Madara's thinking became especially unsettling to those who later judged him. He did not see suffering as something that strengthened character. He saw it as something that distorted it. People who grew up in pain learned to replicate pain. Those who lost early learned to take preemptively. Trauma did not refine morality. It narrowed it. Compassion, under constant threat, became selective. Madara contrasted this with the idealized stories people told themselves about hardship. They spoke of growth, of lessons learned, of bonds forged in adversity. Madara did not deny these outcomes existed. He questioned whether they justified the cost. For every person who emerged stronger, countless others were broken quietly, their potential never realized. The world celebrated the survivors and ignored the casualties. Madara found this dishonest. To him, a system that required suffering to produce virtue was fundamentally flawed. This conviction reshaped how Madara viewed freedom. Freedom, as the world defined it, meant the ability to choose, even if those choices led to harm. But Madara began to ask a different question. What value does freedom have if it predictably produces misery? If a person freely chooses violence, is that freedom worth preserving? If entire societies freely repeat cycles of destruction, is autonomy still sacred? These questions did not make Madara cruel. They made him precise. He recognized that freedom was often romanticized because people feared the alternative. Loss of choice felt like loss of self. But Madara believed this fear was rooted in misunderstanding. Choice, in his view, was not synonymous with identity. Identity was shaped by experience, memory, and emotion. If those elements could be preserved, or even improved, without exposing people to harm, then freedom as an abstract principle lost its primacy. Madara's plan did not seek to erase individuality. It sought to remove the friction between individuals. In a shared dream, no one needed to dominate or submit. Fulfillment did not come at another's expense. Desire could be satisfied without competition. Love could exist without fear of loss. In such a state, the impulses that fueled war simply had no function. Critics would later argue that this was stagnation. Madara disagreed. He believed growth did not require pain. Curiosity, creativity, and connection could exist without suffering. The world simply had never tried that path seriously. It had accepted pain as inevitable and built its philosophies around managing it rather than eliminating it. As Madara refined his vision, he also refined his patience. He understood that his plan could not be rushed. The world needed to reach a certain threshold of power and exhaustion before it could be reshaped. People needed to see enough war to recognize its futility, but not so much that they lost the capacity to dream of something better. Timing mattered. This patience was often mistaken for passivity. In truth, Madara was waiting for alignment of forces, of knowledge, of opportunity. He studied quietly. He observed the rise and fall of leaders. He noted how often ideals collapsed under pressure, how frequently peace dissolved into violence when resources grew scarce. Each example reinforced his belief that the world, left to itself, would never stabilize. Madara's detachment during this period was not indifference. It was restraint. He understood that intervening too early would only reset the cycle, not end it. Smaller conflicts were symptoms, not the disease. Ending them individually accomplished nothing. The structure that produced them had to be addressed all at once. This was why Madara's vision required totality. Partial measures would fail. A single nation embracing peace could be conquered. A single generation taught compassion could be undone by the next. Even a global alliance could fracture under pressure. Only a solution that removed the very conditions for fracture could last. Madara accepted that such a solution would be terrifying to those who valued struggle as meaning. He accepted that it would be misunderstood as nihilism or control. But from his perspective, it was the opposite. It was an affirmation that life deserved better than endless conflict. That existence did not need to be a test of endurance to have value. In his quiet moments, Madara sometimes imagined the world after his plan succeeded, not in vivid detail, but in sensation, a deep stillness, no background tension, no fear humming beneath daily life, people waking without bracing themselves for loss, children growing without being shaped by stories of war, history itself becoming gentle, unburdened by cycles of revenge. This image sustained him, not as fantasy, but as purpose. Madara knew he would never live in that world as himself. His role was to build it, not inhabit it. That understanding did not embitter him. It clarified him. If peace required his absence, then absence was a small price. He had already lost everything that tied him to the present world anyway. What remained was resolve, quiet, immovable, and deeply mournful. Madara was not rushing toward destruction. He was walking steadily toward silence, toward a world that no longer needed warriors, or villages, or legends born from blood. In giving up on peace, as others understood it, Madara had not abandoned hope. He had redefined it. Hope was no longer something placed in people. It was something built around them, protecting them from themselves. And as the world continued to turn, repeating its familiar patterns, Madara waited, certain that time, more than any argument, would eventually prove him right. As Madara's vision continued to mature, it became increasingly shaped by time, not merely the passing of years, but the weight of repetition. He had now lived long enough, observed enough cycles, to see how history rarely moved forward in a straight line. Instead, it curved back on itself, revisiting the same conflicts under different names. Nations changed, leaders changed, banners changed. Yet the emotional core of conflict remained remarkably consistent. Fear of loss, hunger for validation, desire for control. These forces resurfaced again and again, indifferent to progress. Madara understood that people often mistook change in appearance for change in substance. Villages were built to replace clans. Alliances replaced truces. Diplomacy replaced brute force. And yet, beneath these refinements, the same calculations persisted. Who held power? Who felt threatened? Who would act first? Peace was still reactive, always defined by what it was trying to prevent rather than what it sought to create. This was why Madara increasingly dismissed the language of political peace. Treaties were written not because trust existed, but because mistrust demanded structure. Armies were maintained not because war was desired, but because peace required leverage. Even the most idealistic leaders relied on force in reserve. To Madara, this was not peace. It was deferred violence. What troubled him most was how comfortable people became living this way. Over time, they adapted to constant tension, normalizing it until they could no longer imagine an alternative. Children grew up hearing stories of past wars as cautionary tales. Yet those same stories subtly taught them that war was inevitable. Even in peace, The expectation of future conflict shaped education, economy, and culture. The world prepared endlessly for what it claimed to want to avoid. Madara found this psychologically exhausting, not just for himself, but for humanity as a whole. A world permanently braced for impact could never truly rest. And a world that could not rest would always lash out eventually. To him, peace needed to be something that allowed the collective mind to finally unclench. This was where his thinking diverged completely from conventional morality. Most moral systems accepted suffering as a cost of existence, something to be minimized, but never eliminated. Madara rejected this premise outright. If suffering could be eliminated, then allowing it to persist became indefensible. Intentions did not matter. Explanations did not matter. Only outcomes mattered. Madara was acutely aware that this placed him outside the emotional comfort of most people. Many found meaning in struggle. They defined themselves by what they had endured. Madara did not deny their sincerity. He questioned whether their meaning was freely chosen or simply adapted from necessity. When survival is difficult, endurance becomes a virtue. But if survival no longer demanded pain, would people still cling to suffering as identity? He suspected they would not. Madara's vision of peace was often criticized as sterile or artificial, but to him, it was profoundly humane. It did not ask people to be better than they were. It did not demand forgiveness, discipline, or endless patience. It acknowledged weakness rather than condemning it. People would not need to suppress fear or desire. Those impulses would simply lose their destructive outlets. As these thoughts deepened, Madara began to understand why resistance to his ideas would be so fierce. His plan threatened not just power structures, but narratives. Entire identities were built around overcoming hardship. Nations defined themselves through shared suffering. Heroes were remembered because they triumphed over pain. Remove suffering, and those stories lose their central tension. Madara accepted this loss without regret. Stories, to him, were never worth lives. He also understood that his plan would be judged harshly because it challenged a deeply held assumption that reality, as it is inherently sacred. Madara did not share this reverence. Reality had taken too much from him to be treated as untouchable. If reality produced endless grief, then altering it was not sacrilege. It was responsibility. During this period, Madara's thoughts turned increasingly toward scale. Individual peace was achievable. People found moments of happiness, love, and fulfillment even in harsh worlds. But collective peace, the kind that spared entire generations, remained elusive. Madara concluded that any solution operating at the individual level would always be overwhelmed by collective forces. The solution had to be collective as well, encompassing everyone at once. This insight reaffirmed the necessity of a unified experience. A shared dream was not about control. It was about synchronization. In a synchronized world, misunderstanding vanished. No one feared what they could fully comprehend. No one envied what no longer felt scarce. Conflict required separation, of experience, of perspective, of desire. Remove that separation, and conflict lost its foundation. Madara often reflected on how shinobi battles were decided. Victory did not come from raw power alone, but from reading the opponent, anticipating their movements, understanding their intent. The Sharingan excelled at this because it closed the gap between perception and reality. Madara's plan, at its core, sought to do the same on a global scale, to remove the blindness that made people harm one another unintentionally. He did not believe humanity was evil. He believed it was misaligned. This distinction mattered deeply to him. If people were inherently malicious, then peace would be impossible under any system. But if they were simply shaped by conflicting needs and incomplete understanding, then peace could be engineered by resolving those conflicts at the level of experience. Madara chose to believe the latter, even as others accused him of losing faith in humanity. In truth, his plan was born from believing humanity deserved protection from its own limitations. Madara's isolation during this phase was complete, but not lonely. He no longer sought validation or agreement. Those desires belonged to a world he had already left behind. What remained was purpose, steady and unwavering. Every observation, every historical recurrence, every broken piece reinforced the same conclusion. The world would not save itself. As years passed, Madara's ideas became less reactive and more serene. Anger had burned out, replaced by a quiet resolve. He no longer argued internally with opposing viewpoints. He had followed every alternative to its end and found them lacking. What remained was not obsession, but acceptance. This acceptance extended even to opposition. Madara knew people would fight him, not because they loved suffering, but because they feared change. He did not resent them for this. Fear, after all, was one of the forces he sought to eliminate. Their resistance only confirmed the depth of the problem. People clung to a painful world because it was familiar, not because it was good. In this way, Madara's compassion became almost impersonal. He cared not for approval, but for outcome. He was willing to be misunderstood forever if it meant the world could finally rest. That willingness marked the final transformation of his philosophy, from grief-driven reaction to deliberate, encompassing vision. Peace, as Madara now understood it, was not an event to be achieved, nor a balance to be maintained. It was a state to be entered permanently and without condition, a state where history no longer needed to repeat itself because the forces that drove repetition had been dissolved. As Madara stood at this threshold in his thinking, his path forward was clear. The remaining steps were not about whether he should act, but when and how. The moral question had already been answered in his mind. Allowing the world to continue as it was would be the greater cruelty. And so, Madara waited, not in doubt, not in anger, but in certainty. the kind of certainty that does not shout or demand agreement, the kind that simply endures, knowing that time, repetition, and exhaustion would eventually guide the world toward the same conclusion he had reached long ago. Peace, if it was to be real, would have to be final. By the time Madara's philosophy reached this depth, it no longer existed as a series of conclusions, but as a quiet internal landscape he inhabited completely. His thoughts no longer rushed toward justification or defense. They moved slowly, deliberately, like water settling after a long storm. What remained was not urgency, but inevitability. The world, as it was, could only produce certain outcomes, and Madara believed he had finally traced those outcomes back to their source. He began to see conflict not as a failure of morality, but as a failure of alignment. People wanted peace, yet acted in ways that undermined it. They valued love, yet structured their societies around competition. They desired safety, yet normalized violence as a tool. These contradictions were not conscious hypocrisies. They were the result of living within a world that rewarded one set of behaviors while praising another. Madara no longer blamed individuals for this. He blamed the environment that shaped them. This distinction mattered deeply to him because it clarified something essential. Punishment could never solve the problem. Condemning people for actions shaped by circumstance was meaningless. Even justice, as the world understood it, was reactive. It addressed harm after it occurred, never preventing it in the first place. Madara wanted a world where justice was unnecessary because harm no longer arose. In this sense, his vision was preventative rather than authoritarian. He did not seek to rule over humanity. He sought to remove the conditions that made rule necessary. A world without conflict did not require leaders, armies, or enforcement. It required coherence. It required a shared emotional reality where fear and desire no longer collided. Madara's growing clarity also brought with it a painful awareness of what his plan would erase. Struggle had shaped art, myth, and identity for centuries. Entire cultures were built around overcoming adversity. Songs, stories, and rituals drew meaning from survival against odds. Madara acknowledged the beauty in these expressions, but he refused to romanticize their cause. Art born from suffering was still born from suffering. He questioned why beauty needed pain as its raw material at all. He imagined a different kind of creativity, one not forged in response to trauma, but emerging from curiosity and joy. A world where expression did not exist to process grief, but to explore possibility. This, too, reinforced his belief that peace without struggle was not emptiness, but abundance. As Madara's thinking evolved, he also became more aware of the emotional resistance his vision would encounter. People clung to their pain because it validated their experiences. Letting go of suffering felt like invalidating the past. Madara understood this fear intimately. He carried his own losses with him always. But he refused to believe that honoring the dead required repeating the conditions that killed them. Memory, in Madara's view, did not need to be preserved through continued suffering. It could exist without being weaponized. Grief did not have to be inherited. The world simply lacked the courage to release it. Madara's plan, increasingly refined, did not aim to erase memory. It aimed to soften it. Painful experiences would remain, but their sharpness would fade. They would no longer dominate identity or dictate behavior. People could remember loss without being defined by it. This was not denial of reality, but a rebalancing of its emotional weight. The more Madara contemplated this, the more he realized that opposition to his vision often came from those who benefited from the existing world. Leaders, warriors, and institutions drew purpose from conflict. Even those who suffered within the system sometimes defended it because it gave their suffering meaning. Madara found this tragic. The system asked people to justify their own pain rather than question its necessity. Madara did not believe humanity lacked compassion. He believed compassion was selectively applied because resources, emotional and physical, were scarce. People learned to care deeply for some while hardening themselves against others. In a world without scarcity of fulfillment, compassion could become universal rather than conditional. No longer a finite resource, it could flow freely. This was another reason Madara rejected gradual reform. Scarcity would always exist in the physical world. Land, power, recognition, time, all limited. As long as people competed for limited resources, conflict would remain inevitable. Only a world unbound by physical limitation could escape this logic. A world where fulfillment was not zero-sum. The dream state offered exactly that. Infinite space, infinite possibility. No hierarchy imposed by circumstance. Each individual could experience completeness without diminishing another. Madara saw this not as fantasy, but as evolution. Humanity had already evolved from survival to society. This would simply be the next step. Existence beyond conflict. Madara also reflected on the irony that many would call his vision escapism, while spending their lives escaping pain through distraction, ideology, or denial. At least his escape, he believed, was honest. It did not pretend the world was kind. It acknowledged its cruelty and chose to move beyond it, rather than endure it indefinitely. His calm during this period was often mistaken for detachment, but it was the calm of resolution, not apathy. He no longer debated alternatives because he had exhausted them. Every path that preserved the physical world as it was led back to suffering. The only remaining question was whether the world would accept salvation, even if it feared it. Madara did not expect gratitude. He expected resistance. He expected to be misunderstood, condemned, and opposed by those who could not imagine peace without struggle. This no longer troubled him. His concern was not how he would be remembered, but whether future generations would ever need to remember him at all. A truly successful peace, Madara believed, would erase the need for villains and heroes alike. History would slow, then soften. Without conflict to drive narrative, time itself would feel gentler. People would no longer measure eras by wars, nor define progress by conquest. Life would become quieter, but also fuller. Madara understood that quiet frightened people accustomed to chaos. Silence exposed inner emptiness. Many preferred noise, even painful noise, to confronting that emptiness. His vision offered something radically different: stillness without fear, rest without guilt, existence without constant vigilance. In his rare moments of introspection, Madara acknowledged that his plan required absolute confidence. Doubt could not be allowed, because partial commitment would doom the outcome. This did not mean he ignored uncertainty. It meant he accepted responsibility for it. If his vision failed, the fault would be his alone. He was willing to bear that weight. This acceptance marked the final maturation of Madara's philosophy. He was no longer reacting to trauma or arguing against the world. He was choosing a future with full awareness of what it cost: the loss of freedom, the end of struggle, the rewriting of reality itself. These were not side effects. They were the price of peace. Madara paid that price willingly in his mind long before he ever acted in the world. He grieved the loss of the old world, even as he prepared to replace it. He did not hate what existed. He simply believed it had reached its limit. And so, with his vision complete and his resolve steady, Madara stood ready to move from contemplation into action, not out of rage, not out of ambition, but out of a quiet certainty that the world had exhausted every other option. Peace, as Madara now understood it, was no longer a request. It was an answer, as Madara's vision settled into something complete and unwavering. His attention turned toward the moment when belief must inevitably transform into action. Philosophy, no matter how refined, could not reshape the world on its own. The world moved according to power, momentum, and opportunity. Madara understood that to change the course of history, his ideas would need a vessel capable of carrying them forward beyond his own lifespan, beyond the limitations of a single body or moment in time. This realization did not trouble him. Madara had long since accepted that his role was not to enjoy the peace he envisioned, but to initiate it. He had never imagined himself as a ruler of the new world. In fact, the very idea repelled him. Authority, as the world understood it, was inseparable from conflict. To rule meant to arbitrate between competing desires, to enforce boundaries, to punish defiance. Madara's peace would make such roles obsolete. What concerned him instead was continuity. The world was resistant to change precisely because it absorbed disruption and returned to equilibrium. Revolutions collapsed. Empires fell. ideologies softened. Time wore down even the most radical intentions. If his vision was to succeed, it would need to outlast opposition, erosion, and reinterpretation. It would need to be inevitable. Madara began to think deeply about legacy, not in terms of reputation, but in terms of causality. How did ideas survive? Not through persuasion alone, but through embedding themselves into the structure of reality. Laws, traditions, and institutions were examples of this. Once established, they shaped behavior even among those who disagreed with them. Madara sought something even deeper, a mechanism so fundamental that resistance became irrelevant. This was why his attention remained fixed on chakra in its most primordial form. Chakra was the thread connecting all living beings, regardless of ideology or allegiance. It flowed through everyone equally, shaping perception, emotion, and possibility. If chakra itself could be aligned toward peace, then conflict would lose its energy source. Violence would not need to be outlawed. It would simply lose its appeal. Madara understood that this alignment could not be achieved through education or moral teaching. People interpreted teachings through the lens of their experiences, twisting meaning to justify existing beliefs. Chakra, however, responded directly to intent. It did not argue. It manifested. To alter the flow of chakra was to alter the emotional weather of the world itself. This understanding gave Madara's plan a new clarity. The Infinite Tsukuyomi was no longer just a shared dream. It was a recalibration of consciousness, a way to harmonize the inner worlds of countless individuals without forcing them into uniform thought. Each person would experience fulfillment uniquely, yet without conflict, because the underlying structure would be aligned. Madara often reflected on how shinobi spoke of peace as something fragile, something to be protected. He rejected this framing entirely. Peace should not need protection. Anything that could be broken so easily was not peace. It was temporary restraint. True peace would be self-sustaining, requiring no guardians, no sacrifices, no constant vigilance. This belief reshaped how Madara viewed sacrifice itself. Throughout history, people had offered lives, freedoms, and futures in the name of peace. These sacrifices were celebrated as noble, even necessary. Madara saw them as evidence of failure. A system that demanded endless sacrifice had already conceded its inability to resolve conflict permanently. His plan, by contrast, demanded a single, concentrated sacrifice, the relinquishing of unrestrained choice. To Madara, this was not the destruction of humanity, but its release from an impossible burden. Choice, as the world understood it, asked people to navigate infinite complexity with finite understanding. Mistakes were inevitable. Suffering followed. Removing that burden was not cruelty. It was mercy. Madara's own life served as proof that even the strongest, most perceptive individuals could not navigate this complexity without loss. He had seen further than most. He had loved deeply. He had tried peace. And still, he had failed to protect what mattered. If someone like him could not succeed within the existing system, then the system itself was beyond repair. This conviction removed any lingering hesitation. Madara no longer wondered whether his vision was justified. He wondered only how long the world would take to reach the same conclusion on its own. Every new conflict, every betrayed treaty, every child raised to fight brought the world closer to exhaustion. Madara did not need to rush history. History was already moving toward him. During this period, Madara's calm deepened into something almost monastic. He was no longer driven by grief, though grief had shaped him. He was driven by acceptance. The world was not evil, but it was incurable in its current form. Clinging to it out of sentiment would only prolong suffering. Letting it go required courage of a different kind. Madara also recognized that his plan would be misinterpreted as domination because people equated influence with control. But influence, he believed, could also be protective. Parents limited their children's choices not to dominate them, but to keep them safe. Society already accepted countless constraints on freedom in the name of safety and order. Madara's plan was simply the ultimate extension of that logic. What frightened people was not the loss of freedom, but the loss of struggle as identity. Without struggle, many feared they would become meaningless. Madara saw this fear as the final proof of how deeply suffering had been woven into human self-conception. His vision challenged people to imagine value without pain, existence without adversity. That challenge felt threatening because it exposed how little the world had tried any other way. Madara did not expect people to understand this immediately. Understanding was not required for success. The world did not need to agree with him. It only needed to be changed. This was not arrogance, but realism. Systems did not collapse because everyone agreed they were wrong. They collapsed because something more stable replaced them. As Madara contemplated the future, he did not imagine resistance fading away. He imagined it becoming irrelevant. Opposition required an arena. His plan removed the arena itself. Without competition, without scarcity, without fear, there was nothing left to fight over. Conflict would dissolve not through defeat, but through obsolescence. This perspective allowed Madara to release the last traces of anger he carried toward the world. Anger implied expectation. He no longer expected the world to improve on its own. He had accepted responsibility for improvement himself. That acceptance brought a strange peace even before his plan was realized. Madara understood that his path would be lonely to the end. No one could truly walk it with him. Those who shared parts of his vision would fall away when the cost became clear. This did not deter him. Solitude was familiar. He had been alone since the moment he realized that compromise could not save the future. What sustained him now was not hope in people, but certainty in outcome. A certainty earned through observation, loss, and relentless honesty. The world would resist. It would fight. It would misunderstand. And then, finally, it would rest. In this quiet certainty, Madara prepared for the final stages of his plan. Not with urgency, but with patience, refined by centuries of repetition. He was no longer racing against time. Time was moving toward him. Peace was no longer an aspiration. It was an inevitability waiting to be enacted. As the final shape of Madara's vision came into focus, his attention shifted from the abstract certainty of peace to the fragile bridge between intention and execution. The world did not change simply because someone understood it completely. Change required leverage, moments where the structure of reality became malleable, where accumulated tension could be redirected rather than released destructively. Madara understood that such moments were rare, born from convergence rather than planning alone. Power, timing, and exhaustion had to align. Madara had watched the world long enough to recognize these inflection points. They emerged after great wars, after ideologies failed publicly, after leaders lost moral authority. In those moments, people were most receptive to radical solutions, not because they agreed with them, but because the old answers no longer satisfied. Madara did not seek to persuade the world. He intended to meet it precisely when persuasion was no longer necessary. This understanding reframed how Madara viewed conflict itself. Wars were not obstacles to peace. They were symptoms accelerating the world toward a breaking point. Each war exposed the limits of restraint. Each alliance that fractured revealed the instability beneath diplomacy. Each generation trained for combat carried the weight of proof that the system was unsustainable. Madara did not celebrate this suffering, but he acknowledged its role. The world was teaching itself the lesson it refused to learn voluntarily. Madara also understood that people rarely abandon flawed systems because of logic alone. They abandon them because the emotional cost becomes unbearable. Fatigue erodes loyalty. Grief dissolves idealism. When enough people reach that state simultaneously, the ground becomes fertile for transformation. Madara's plan was not to create this exhaustion, but to recognize it and act decisively when it arrived. In this sense, Madara's patience was strategic rather than passive. He was waiting for the moment when the world's defenses against radical change weakened, not physically, but psychologically. A world confident in its path could not be redirected. A world doubting itself could. This was why Madara paid such close attention to symbols. Symbols condensed meaning. They shaped collective emotion faster than reason ever could. Villages themselves were symbols of unity, of safety, of shared identity. When those symbols cracked, the damage was deeper than any battlefield loss. Trust eroded. Purpose wavered. People began searching for alternatives, even ones they would have once rejected outright. Madara intended to become such a symbol, not as a savior, but as a disruption. His return to history was not meant to inspire hope or fear alone, but to force a reckoning. The world would be compelled to confront the question it had avoided for centuries. Was endless struggle truly preferable to a peace that demanded surrender of control? Madara understood the irony of this role. He despised the cult of personality that surrounded great leaders, yet he knew the world responded to figures more than ideas. Concepts required time to spread. Figures accelerated change through presence alone. Madara accepted this contradiction as necessary. If the world required a villain to abandon its illusions, he would play that role without hesitation. This acceptance marked a subtle shift in how Madara viewed morality. Earlier, he had rejected conventional ethics as insufficient. Now, he saw morality itself as contextual, a framework designed to preserve the existing world. When the world itself was the problem, morality became a barrier rather than a guide. This did not mean anything became permissible. It meant outcomes outweighed intentions. Madara's internal compass was no longer aligned to approval or condemnation. It was aligned to reduction of suffering across time. A single act that caused fear now but ended violence forever was, to him, preferable to countless acts of kindness that prolonged the cycle. This calculus disturbed many, but Madara did not flinch from it. He believed that refusing to make such calculations was how the world justified endless compromise. The closer Madara came to action, the more clearly he saw how deeply people equated pain with authenticity. Many believed that a life without struggle would be shallow, artificial, or meaningless. Madara challenged this assumption fundamentally. He argued, internally if not aloud, that meaning born from necessity was not inherently superior to meaning born from choice. The problem was that choice in the physical world was never truly free. It was constrained by fear, scarcity, and inherited trauma. A dream world, by contrast, could offer choice without those constraints. Desire could exist without desperation, ambition without rivalry, identity without threat. Madara believed this would allow a deeper form of meaning to emerge, one not constantly reacting to danger, but exploring possibility. The world had never known such a state long enough to judge it fairly. Madara also reflected on how people spoke of earning peace. This language troubled him. Peace was treated as a reward, something conditional upon behavior, discipline, or sacrifice. Madara rejected this framing entirely. No one earned the right to be born into war. No one consented to a world structured around violence. Peace, in his view, was not a prize. It was a baseline that had been unjustly withheld. As this conviction solidified, Madara's emotional state became increasingly still. There was no thrill in what he planned, no sense of conquest. There was only responsibility. He felt as though he were carrying a truth too heavy for the world to bear willingly. If he set it down, nothing would change. If he carried it forward alone, something finally might. Madara understood that many would see his calm as inhuman. They would mistake composure for lack of empathy. In reality, His calm was the result of having grieved everything already. He had mourned the world as it was. He had mourned the lives lost, and the lives yet to be lost, if nothing changed. Action now felt less like destruction and more like closure. As he prepared for the final steps, Madara no longer imagined resistance as something to overcome, but as something to absorb. Opposition would validate the old world's attachment to struggle. It would demonstrate exactly why his plan was necessary. The louder the resistance, the clearer the proof that peace built on consent alone could never be universal. Madara did not seek to convince his enemies. He expected them to fight him with everything they had. Their resistance would be sincere, even noble, within their understanding. Madara respected that, but respect did not require agreement. He had long since accepted that the final barrier to peace would be humanity's fear of letting go. In his quiet reflections, Madara sometimes acknowledged the tragic symmetry of his path. He had once dreamed of peace alongside Hashirama, imagining a future built slowly by trust. That dream had failed not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Trust alone could not carry the weight of history. Madara now carried that weight himself. This acceptance did not harden him. It simplified him. There were no longer multiple paths to consider, no lingering alternatives to evaluate. The world had chosen repetition. He had chosen finality. These choices were now set on a collision course. As Madara stood on the threshold between contemplation and action, he did not feel anticipation or dread. He felt alignment. Everything he had observed, every loss he had endured, every cycle he had witnessed pointed to this moment. The world would resist the ending of struggle because struggle had become familiar. Madara would proceed anyway, because familiarity was not the same as necessity. Peace, as Madara envisioned it, was no longer fragile or distant. It was near, heavy with consequence, and irrevocable. It would not ask permission. It would arrive as an answer the world had been circling for centuries without the courage to speak aloud. And with that certainty settled fully within him, Madara prepared to act, not to rule, not to destroy, but to conclude. By the time Madara's resolve crystallized into action, his understanding of humanity had reached a depth few ever attained. He no longer viewed people as individuals alone, nor merely as masses swept along by history, but as emotional systems repeating inherited patterns. Each generation believed itself more enlightened than the last, yet carried the same fears beneath different names. Madara saw this repetition not as failure of intelligence, but as evidence that the structure of the world itself enforced certain outcomes, regardless of intention. At the heart of this structure was competition for limited security. Villages competed for military advantage. Clans competed for influence. Individuals competed for recognition, safety, and belonging. Even cooperation was often transactional, sustained only while interests aligned. Madara understood that as long as security remained scarce and conditional, conflict would always regenerate, no matter how many treaties were signed or leaders replaced. This realization sharpened Madara's critique of the shinobi system itself. The system did not merely respond to war, it institutionalized it. Children were trained to kill before they understood why. Loyalty was praised not for its morality, but for its usefulness. Sacrifice was romanticized, masking the fact that it was demanded disproportionately from the powerless. Madara did not deny that the system produced moments of heroism. He argued instead that heroism was required precisely because the system was broken. In this light, Madara saw peace treaties as pauses rather than solutions. They reduced visible violence, but preserved the mechanisms that created it. Hatred was not eliminated. It was deferred, stored quietly within borders and doctrines until the next rupture. The shinobi world had grown skilled at managing hatred, but incapable of dissolving it. Madara's vision aimed directly at this root. The Infinite Tsukuyomi was not merely a tool of control, as many would later claim, but a structural inversion. It removed scarcity of emotional fulfillment. In a world where safety, recognition, and belonging were guaranteed internally, the incentives driving conflict vanished. Ambition no longer required domination. Identity no longer required opposition. Loss no longer defined meaning. Madara was fully aware that critics would label this artificial, but he questioned whether the existing world was any more authentic. If identity was shaped by fear of death, trauma of loss, and pressure to conform, was that truly freedom? Madara believed authenticity without choice was an illusion. The dream world, paradoxically, offered greater freedom by removing the coercive forces that shaped desire itself. As he reflected on this, Madara acknowledged a painful irony. Many of the people who would oppose him most fiercely were those who had suffered deeply and emerged with compassion. Their resilience would be cited as proof that suffering had value. Madara did not deny their strength. He denied the premise that strength justified the suffering that produced it. To Madara, this argument resembled praising disease for creating immunity. Survival did not sanctify the conditions that threatened it. Growth born from pain did not make pain necessary. Humanity's reverence for endurance had become a moral blind spot, preventing it from imagining a world where endurance was no longer required. Madara's thoughts also returned inevitably to Hashirama. Hashirama had believed that peace must be chosen freely, even if that freedom led repeatedly to war. Madara once shared that belief. What separated them now was not compassion, but tolerance for imperfection. Hashirama accepted a flawed peace as better than imposed harmony. Madara saw flawed peace as indistinguishable from delayed violence. Madara understood that Hashirama's philosophy preserved moral agency at the cost of perpetual suffering. Madara was willing to sacrifice agency to eliminate suffering entirely. This divergence was not intellectual alone. It was emotional. Hashirama believed in humanity's potential to change. Madara believed humanity had already proven the limits of that potential. This belief did not come from cynicism, but from grief accumulated over decades. Madara had watched children inherit vendettas they did not start. He had seen apologies buried beneath new bloodshed. He had seen hope briefly ignite, only to be extinguished by fear. Each repetition reinforced the same conclusion. Left to its own devices, the world corrected nothing permanently. As Madara prepared to enact his plan, he no longer framed opposition as misunderstanding. He understood his enemies perfectly. They feared losing the right to choose their pain, the right to struggle, the right to define themselves against adversity. Madara saw these rights as tragic attachments rather than virtues. This was why Madara never attempted to argue publicly for his vision in detail. Debate assumed a shared framework of values. Madara had stepped outside that framework entirely. Words could not bridge the gap between those who believed suffering was meaningful and one who believed meaning itself could exist without suffering. Only action could resolve that contradiction. Madara also recognized that his plan would erase certain forms of beauty the world cherished. There would be no triumphant comebacks, no legends forged through adversity, no songs about survival against impossible odds. Madara accepted this loss. He believed beauty born from relief, exploration, and peace could replace it. Beauty the world had never allowed itself to cultivate fully. In quieter moments, Madara acknowledged the loneliness of his position. To carry a solution that others could not accept was to stand perpetually misunderstood. He would be remembered not for what he sought to end, but for how he forced the ending. Madara accepted that history rarely honored those who resolved contradictions rather than navigating them. As his resolve hardened, Madara's sense of time shifted. Past, present, and future blurred into a single continuum of cause and effect. His own life felt less like a personal journey and more like a function of historical necessity. He was not acting for himself, nor even for his clan, but as an instrument responding to accumulated failure. Madara did not believe himself infallible. He believed delay was worse. The longer the world persisted as it was, the more suffering would be normalized, justified, and inherited. Even if his solution was imperfect, it offered finality, where the world offered only recurrence. This is what made Madara terrifying to his enemies. Not his power alone, but his refusal to bargain with the status quo. He did not seek partial reform, incremental improvement, or symbolic gestures. He sought closure. As the moment approached, Madara felt no hatred toward those who would oppose him. He felt a quiet sadness, tinged with resolve. They were guardians of a world he had already mourned. Their courage would be real, their resistance sincere. And still, it would not change the outcome he believed necessary. Madara's philosophy had reached its final form. Peace was not something to be maintained, defended, or earned. It was something to be enforced precisely because humanity could not sustain it voluntarily. The tragedy, in his eyes, was not that he would impose peace, but that the world had made such imposition necessary. Standing at the edge of action, Madara did not see himself as a god, nor a tyrant. He saw himself as an ending, an answer to a question humanity had asked through endless war, but never dared to resolve. And with that understanding complete, Madara moved forward, fully aware that the final barrier to peace was not power, nor resistance, nor ideology, but humanity's refusal to release the pain it had mistaken for purpose. As Madara's plan moved from conviction into inevitability, the world around him began to feel strangely distant, as though he were already observing it from beyond its final chapter. Villages still trained shinobi. Leaders still debated policy. Conflicts still ignited along borders and ideologies. Yet to Madara, these motions resembled echoes rather than events, repetitions playing out long after their meaning had been exhausted. The world was busy, but not progressing. Madara understood that one of the greatest obstacles to peace was not hatred itself, but the way hatred disguised itself as virtue. Loyalty to one's village was praised, even when it justified cruelty. Love for comrades was celebrated, even when it demanded the destruction of others. Honor was invoked to sanctify violence, turning moral contradictions into unquestioned traditions. Over time, these ideals hardened into dogma, immune to reflection. This was why Madara believed that the problem could not be solved through education or reform alone. Even when people recognized injustice, they were constrained by identities built around it. To reject the shinobi system entirely would mean rejecting the sacrifices of ancestors, the meaning of inherited pain, and the stories that gave structure to their lives. Most people could not endure that kind of existential loss. Madara himself had endured it. The deaths of his brothers had stripped away his ability to romanticize conflict. Each funeral revealed the hollowness behind phrases like necessary sacrifice. Over time, grief sharpened into clarity. He saw that suffering was not a teacher guiding humanity upward, but a cycle grinding it down, shaping identities through trauma rather than wisdom. In this clarity, Madara revisited the idea of free will. His critics argued that the Infinite Tsukuyomi would rob humanity of choice, reducing people to passive dreamers. Madara countered this silently with a deeper question. How free was choice in a world governed by fear, scarcity, and inherited hatred? When a child was born into war, trained to kill, and praised for obedience, was their eventual violence truly chosen? Madara concluded that free will under coercive conditions was largely theoretical. Choices existed, but only within narrow corridors defined by survival. The dream world would remove those constraints. Within it, desire could emerge without threat. Identity could form without opposition. Peace would not need to be defended because it would not be fragile. This did not mean Madara believed the dream world to be perfect. Perfection was irrelevant. Stability was what mattered. The shinobi world had mistaken dynamism for virtue, celebrating constant struggle as proof of vitality. Madara saw constant struggle as evidence of failure. A system that required endless correction had not earned its endurance. As he moved closer to execution, Madara reflected on how history would interpret him. He knew he would be labeled a tyrant, a monster, a god playing with lives. These labels no longer disturbed him. History, he believed, was written by those who survived systems, not those crushed by them. If the Infinite Tsukuyomi succeeded, there would be no historians left to condemn him, only people living lives untouched by war. Madara also understood the emotional cost of his role. To carry the burden of ending the world as it was meant relinquishing sympathy. Those who opposed him would do so sincerely, driven by love for their comrades and faith in human resilience. Madara did not despise them. He saw them as the final expression of a worldview he believed had run its course. In moments of stillness, Madara allowed himself to imagine what the dream world might feel like for others. Children growing without fear of loss. Families untouched by conscription. Bonds formed not in trenches, but in shared peace. These visions were not grand or dramatic. They were quiet, ordinary, and precisely because of that, revolutionary. Madara contrasted this with the shinobi world's fixation on heroic suffering. Legends were born through pain. Strength was measured by endurance. Peace, when it appeared, was brief and fragile, celebrated only because it followed devastation. Madara believed humanity had confused tragedy for depth. The dream world would allow meaning to arise from continuity rather than catastrophe. His thoughts returned once more to Hashirama, not as an opponent, but as a symbol of the path Madara had abandoned. Hashirama believed that people must be allowed to fail repeatedly in order to grow. Madara believed the cost of those failures had become indefensible. Their disagreement was no longer personal. It was philosophical to the core. Madara recognized that his solution eliminated certain forms of greatness. There would be no legendary warriors forged through desperation, no stories of triumph against impossible odds. Yet he questioned why such greatness was necessary at all. Why should the measure of humanity be its ability to survive hell, rather than its ability to avoid creating it? As resistance gathered against him, Madara felt a profound stillness. Fear had long since left him. Doubt had been examined and exhausted. What remained was resolve, shaped by grief and patience. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He moved forward as one fulfilling an obligation rather than chasing ambition. Madara also accepted that even if his plan succeeded, it would erase him. There would be no place for Madara Uchiha in a peaceful dream sustained indefinitely. His identity was bound to conflict, to resolution through force. In creating a world without those conditions, he ensured his own irrelevance. This, to Madara, was not tragedy, but proof of sincerity. the closer he came to activating the Infinite Tsukuyomi, the more the shinobi world revealed its contradictions. Alliances formed hastily, united by fear rather than trust. Old enemies fought side by side, proving cooperation was possible, but only under existential threat. Madara saw this as confirmation, not refutation, of his philosophy. If unity required catastrophe, then unity was unsustainable. If peace required a common enemy, then peace was merely a ceasefire in disguise. Madara sought a world where harmony did not depend on crisis. As the final steps approached, Madara felt neither triumph nor despair. He felt completion. The journey from idealistic child to disillusioned visionary had reached its logical end. Peace, as he now understood it, was not something humanity could be guided toward gradually. It had to be imposed decisively, or it would forever retreat behind the next war. Madara's final conviction was simple and unyielding. The shinobi world would never escape its cycle voluntarily. To wait for it to do so was to accept endless suffering as the price of hope. Madara refused that bargain. And so, standing at the threshold of irreversible action, Madara embraced the role history would never forgive. He chose certainty over possibility, silence over screams, and a world without war over a world endlessly preparing for it. To Madara, this was not the abandonment of peace, but the moment he stopped asking humanity to choose it. When Madara finally stood at the point where no further reflection could alter the path ahead, the world appeared to him with a clarity that felt almost merciful. Every contradiction he had wrestled with across his lifetime now aligned into a single, unbroken understanding. The shinobi world was not cruel because people were evil. It was cruel because it was structured in a way that endlessly transformed fear into violence, loss into justification, and memory into obligation. No individual intention, however pure, had ever been strong enough to override that structure for long. Madara saw this truth reflected in history itself. Each era promised reform, yet carried forward the same patterns under new names. New villages replaced old clans. New leaders replaced fallen ones. Ideals shifted, slogans softened, but the underlying mechanics remained unchanged. Children were still trained to fight. Borders were still drawn in blood. Peace was still defined as the absence of war rather than the presence of safety. To Madara, this repetition was the most damning evidence of all. Humanity had been given countless opportunities to break the cycle and had failed every time, not because it lacked goodness, but because goodness alone was insufficient against systems built on fear. Expecting humanity to overcome these systems through moral growth alone had become, in Madara's eyes, an act of quiet cruelty. He understood now why even the noblest shinobi eventually compromised. They were not weak. They were constrained. Leaders who sought peace were forced to maintain armies. Protectors became threats simply by existing. Trust was always conditional, always temporary. The shinobi world demanded vigilance over vulnerability, strength over openness, survival over sincerity. Madara believed that this environment did not merely encourage conflict, it shaped identity itself. People learned who they were by learning who they opposed. Villages defined themselves by rival villages. Clans defined themselves by ancient grudges. Even love was often forged in shared danger rather than shared peace. In such a world, hatred was not an anomaly. It was a feature. The Infinite Tsukuyomi, then, was not conceived as an escape from reality, but as a redefinition of it. Madara did not see dreams as false simply because they were internal. Every human experience, he reasoned, was filtered through perception anyway. Pain felt real because the mind experienced it. Joy felt real for the same reason. If reality was already mediated by consciousness, then reshaping that consciousness was not deception. It was design. Within the dream, the conditions that produced hatred would no longer exist. There would be no scarcity of safety, no competition for recognition, no inherited trauma shaping identity. People would not need to harden themselves to survive. Gentleness would no longer be punished. Vulnerability would no longer be dangerous. The very emotional reflexes that sustained war would lose their purpose. Madara understood that critics would argue this peace was hollow because it removed struggle. But he questioned why struggle had become sacred in the first place. Was a life only meaningful if it overcame pain? Was peace only valuable if it was earned through bloodshed? To Madara, these beliefs revealed how deeply suffering had embedded itself into humanity's moral framework. He believed meaning could exist without trauma. That growth could occur without loss. That joy did not require contrast with despair to be real. These were not naive hopes to him, but possibilities humanity had never truly explored, having been too busy surviving its own systems. As the final moments approached, Madara reflected on how he would be remembered, if he would be remembered at all. He accepted that history, as it existed, would cast him as a villain. Those who resisted him would be hailed as heroes, defending freedom. Madara did not contest this narrative. Stories required antagonists, and he had long since relinquished the desire to be understood within them. What mattered to him was not vindication, but outcome. If his plan succeeded, the world would forget the very conditions that made his actions seem monstrous. Words like war, enemy, and sacrifice would fade into irrelevance. In such a world, Madara's legacy would not be debated because the pain that defined it would no longer exist. Madara also recognized the paradox at the center of his choice. To end suffering, he had to commit an act the world would label unforgivable. To create peace, he had to become the embodiment of coercion. This contradiction did not escape him. He simply judged it unavoidable. The shinobi world had taught him that every peace was built on some form of force. He had merely chosen to make that force final. In quieter reflection, Madara acknowledged that his path required absolute certainty. and that certainty was a dangerous thing. Yet he also saw hesitation as equally dangerous. The world had hesitated for generations, postponing resolution in favor of temporary balance. That balance had always collapsed. Madara chose decisiveness, not because it was safe, but because indecision had proven catastrophic. His thoughts drifted once more to the people who would oppose him, not as enemies, but as symbols of a hope he could no longer share. They believed humanity could learn from its mistakes. Madara believed humanity remembered its pain, but not its lessons. Memory preserved grief, not wisdom. Each generation inherited the scars of the last without inheriting the insight needed to prevent new ones. Madara did not deny the bravery of those who fought for free will. He questioned the cost of that freedom, a freedom that allowed endless war, endless orphans, endless cycles of revenge seemed, to him, indistinguishable from neglect. If choice repeatedly led to devastation, then choice itself required reconsideration. This was the final fracture between Madara and the world he sought to end. Where others saw freedom as sacred regardless of outcome, Madara saw outcome as the ultimate moral measure. A system that preserved agency but guaranteed suffering had failed its purpose. As the Infinite Tsukuyomi drew near, Madara felt an unexpected calm. There was no exhilaration, no triumph, only stillness. The weight he had carried for decades felt lighter, not because it was gone, but because it was finally being set down. His life, shaped by loss and conflict, was reaching a conclusion that felt internally complete. Madara accepted that he would never walk within the peaceful world he envisioned. His existence was tied to struggle, to opposition, to endings. In creating a world without those conditions, he erased the context that gave him meaning. This self-erasure was not a sacrifice, he lamented. It was proof that his motives extended beyond ego. He did not imagine himself ruling the dream world. He did not imagine being worshipped. In truth, he imagined disappearing, becoming irrelevant in a world where relevance was no longer forged through dominance. This, more than anything, confirmed his sincerity. In his final understanding, Madara realized that peace had always been framed as something fragile because humanity had never allowed it to exist without threat. The shinobi world had rehearsed for war endlessly and treated peace as an intermission. Madara sought to reverse that equation, to make peace permanent and conflict impossible. This choice placed him beyond redemption in the eyes of those who survived the old world. Madara accepted this without bitterness. Redemption mattered only within moral systems he no longer believed functional. His responsibility, as he saw it, was not to be forgiven, but to end the suffering that made forgiveness necessary. Standing at the culmination of his journey, Madara did not feel hatred for the world. He felt grief for what it could have been, and resolve to prevent it from continuing as it was. The boy who once dreamed of peace with Hashirama had not vanished. He had simply concluded that dreams required enforcement when reality refused to honor them. And so, with a clarity forged through decades of loss, Madara embraced his final role, not as a savior, not as a tyrant, but as a conclusion, an ending to a world that could not stop wounding itself, and the beginning of one where peace would no longer be asked for, negotiated, or defended. To Madara, this was not surrendering hope. It was making hope unavoidable.